The airport buzzed with life, filled with the hum of conversations, rolling suitcases, and the distant voice of an announcer calling out flight numbers. Jamal stood in line at the check-in counter, shifting on his feet as he clutched his ticket. He was excited. This was his first time flying first class. At just 16, it felt like a huge deal. His father had promised him this trip for months, and now the moment had finally arrived. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, glancing around at the other passengers waiting. Most of them were dressed in expensive suits, fine jewelry, or sleek, designer outfits. Jamal, in his jeans and hoodie, stood out, but he did not think much of it. His family was well off, sure, but his parents had always raised him to stay humble. Money did not make a person better than anyone else. It was what was inside that truly mattered. The line moved forward, and Jamal stepped up to the counter, handing over his boarding pass with a polite smile. The airline employee, a middle-aged woman with neatly styled hair and a sharp uniform, barely glanced at him before her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked down at his ticket, then up at him, skepticism clear in her eyes. "I'm sorry, young man," she said, her voice cool. "I think you might be in the wrong line. This is first-class check-in." Jamal blinked. "Yeah, I know. This is my ticket." He gestured at the paper in her hand, confusion creeping into his voice. The woman sighed, her patience already wearing thin. "Sir, first-class seats are quite expensive. Are you sure this is yours?" A few people in line turned to glance at him. A man in a tailored suit standing behind Jamal scoffed under his breath, shaking his head. "Probably trying to pull a fast one," he muttered. Jamal felt his face heat up. He was not new to this kind of judgment, being a young black teenager in places where people did not expect to see him often led to stares and assumptions. But this was different. He had paid for this ticket. Well, technically, his father had, but it was his seat. "Yeah, I am sure," he said firmly, standing his ground. "You can check it again." The woman exhaled sharply and tapped at her computer. A few seconds passed before her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Well, your name is on the ticket," she admitted, though she did not look happy about it. "But I still need to verify. Do you have any identification?" Jamal handed over his ID, trying not to let his frustration show. He had seen this type of thing happen before, mostly to his dad when they were out at expensive restaurants or shopping, in high-end stores. But his father always handled it calmly, with dignity. Jamal wanted to do the same. She studied his ID, glancing between it and his face like she still did not believe him. Finally, with clear reluctance, she handed everything back. "All right, you are clear to board. But next time, make sure to dress appropriately for first class." Jamal stiffened. His hoodie was clean. His jeans were nice. What was she even talking about? But before he could say anything, another employee signaled for the next passenger, and the line pushed forward. Shaking off the frustration, he grabbed his things and made his way to security. It did not matter. He was going on this trip, and nothing would ruin that for him. But as he reached the gate and stepped onto the plane, he could already feel the eyes of the flight attendants scanning him. The moment he entered the first class cabin, a woman in an elegant dress raised an eyebrow at him. "Excuse me, young man," one of the attendants spoke up. "Are you lost?" Jamal sighed. Here we go again. Little did they know, the owner of the entire airline, the man who made the rules, who decided who flew where and how, was the same man Jamal called Dad. Jamal tightened his grip on his backpack and let out a slow breath. He had been through moments like this before, but something about this time felt different. Maybe it was because he was alone, without his father beside him to shut it down with just a look. Or maybe it was because this was not a store or a restaurant. This was a plane. His plane. His seat. He should not have to prove himself over and over again. "I am not lost," he said, keeping his voice steady. "My seat is 2A. The flight attendant, a tall man with neatly combed hair, gave him a look that was more skepticism than belief. He glanced toward another crew member, a woman with short blonde hair, who immediately stepped forward. "I'm sorry, but first-class seats are reserved for premium passengers," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Maybe you are looking for economy." Jamal's jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of other passengers watching, listening, waiting to see what he would do. Some of them had already decided he did not belong. He could see it in their expressions, the small smirks, the slight tilts of their heads, the way they avoided looking at him directly. "I know where I'm sitting," he replied, handing her his ticket. She hesitated before taking it, scanning the details. Her expression barely changed, but there was a brief flicker of surprise. She quickly masked it, handing the ticket back. "All right," she said, stepping aside. "Enjoy your flight." Jamal did not miss the way she said it, like she still did not believe he belonged there, like she thought there must have been some kind of mistake. He walked to his seat, trying to push away the frustration building inside him. He had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. His father had promised him a break after his exams, a chance to relax before his summer internship started. This flight was supposed to be the beginning of that, but instead, it already felt like another lesson in proving himself. As he settled into the plush leather seat, he pulled out his phone, debating whether to text his dad about what had happened. But he knew what his father would say. "Handle it with grace, son. Let them underestimate you. The moment they find out the truth, their regret will be louder than their doubt." So, he let it go. For now. A few minutes passed, and the flight attendants began their routine, moving through the cabin to take drink orders. The woman from earlier approached again, this time with a little more hesitation. "Would you like anything to drink before takeoff?" she asked, still keeping that professional distance. "Water is fine," Jamal said, not bothering to look up. She nodded and moved on, and for a moment, he thought that was the end of it. But then, from the row behind him, he heard a voice that made his stomach tighten. "I am just saying, back in my day, first class used to have a certain standard," an older man muttered, his voice just loud enough for people nearby to hear. Jamal did not turn around, but he could feel the words directed at him. His fingers tightened into a fist on his lap. "Now they let just about anyone up here," the man continued, chuckling under his breath. Jamal stared out the window, counting slowly in his head to calm himself down. He would not give them a reaction. That was what they wanted, to see if they could push him into proving their assumptions right. But he would not give them the satisfaction. Instead, he put on his headphones and drowned them out. The plane doors closed. The captain's voice came over the speaker, and soon they were in the air. He tried to focus on the view outside, the endless sky stretching beneath them. For a while, it almost worked. But just as the plane reached cruising altitude, a commotion started a few rows ahead. A woman in a crisp navy blue pantsuit was standing, her voice sharp as she spoke to one of the flight attendants. "There must be some mistake," she said, pointing toward Jamal's seat. "I was told this seat was unavailable, but now I see it has been given away." Jamal sighed. He already knew where this was going. The flight attendant, looking slightly uncomfortable, whispered something to the woman, but she was not satisfied. "This is unacceptable," she continued. "I fly this route all the time, and I know how this works. There is no way a seat like that just opens up at the last minute." Jamal finally turned his head, locking eyes with her. Her gaze flickered over him, taking in his face, his hoodie, his skin. And then, like everyone else, she made up her mind. "There must be a mistake," she repeated. Before the flight attendant could respond, Jamal spoke up. "There is no mistake," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is my seat." The woman scoffed. "I highly doubt that." Jamal exhaled slowly. He did not want to argue. He just wanted to get through the flight. But before he could decide what to say next, something unexpected happened. One of the crew members, a man in a pilot's uniform, had been watching the exchange. He suddenly stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He studied Jamal for a long moment, then turned to the flight attendants. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. The woman in the navy blue suit huffed. "I was told seat 2A was unavailable, and yet—" She gestured toward Jamal. The pilot's gaze did not waver. He glanced at Jamal again, then back at the woman. "There is no mistake," he said simply. The woman's expression twisted in frustration. "You do not understand." "I understand perfectly," the pilot interrupted. "And I suggest you return to your seat before this becomes an issue." Jamal did not know why, but something about the way the pilot said it made his pulse quicken. There was something in his tone, something almost knowing. The woman narrowed her eyes but seemed to think better of arguing further. With an irritated sigh, she turned and stomped back to her seat. The pilot lingered for a moment, then gave Jamal a small nod before walking off. Jamal watched him go, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He had no idea who that man was, but something told him this flight was far from over. And soon, everyone on this plane was going to find out exactly who he was. Jamal shifted in his seat, his thoughts racing. The pilot's reaction had thrown him off. Most of the crew had either doubted him or ignored the situation altogether, but this man had stepped in without hesitation. Why? Did he recognize his name? Had his father arranged for someone to watch over him? He glanced around the cabin. The tension had not disappeared. The woman in the navy blue suit was still glaring in his direction every so often, and the older man who had made that comment earlier was now flipping through a newspaper. Like nothing had happened, the flight attendants continued their work, but their eyes occasionally flickered toward him, as if waiting for another issue to arise. Jamal sighed and leaned back in his seat, staring at the seatbelt sign above. He just wanted to get to his destination without all of this. But life never seemed to work that way. A soft chime rang, signaling the start of in-flight service. The same flight attendant who had questioned his seat earlier returned, her polite smile as forced as ever. "Would you like to order dinner?" she asked, her tone professional but distant. Jamal scanned the menu briefly. He was not particularly hungry, but he also did not want to go the entire flight without eating. "I will have the grilled chicken," he said. She nodded, jotting it down. Then, without asking, she turned to the man seated beside him, a middle-aged businessman in an expensive-looking blazer, and flashed a more genuine smile. "And for you, sir?" she asked, her tone suddenly warm. Jamal clenched his jaw but said nothing. He had already decided that no amount of small-minded treatment would ruin his trip. As he waited for his food, he scrolled through his phone, debating again whether to text his dad. He knew his father was busy, probably in some boardroom discussing things that Jamal did not fully understand yet. But a part of him wanted to hear his father's voice, just for a moment. Instead, he tucked his phone away and put his headphones back on, letting the music drown out the murmurs around him. He would get through this flight just like he always did, with patience. But then, something happened that pulled him back into the moment. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, whispering urgently to another crew member. Their eyes darted toward the first-class cabin, and their body language shifted. Jamal could not hear what they were saying, but something was definitely wrong. Passengers began to notice. A few exchanged glances. The businessman beside him sighed and muttered, "What now?" As if the inconvenience of something serious happening was personally offensive to him. Jamal removed his headphones, his attention focused on the two flight attendants. One of them rushed toward the cockpit, her expression tense. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a minor technical issue, but there is no cause for concern. Please, remain in your seats as we assess the situation." Jamal's stomach tightened. Technical issue. He knew airlines always tried to keep things calm, But something about the rushed movements of the crew told him there was more to it. The murmurs in the cabin grew. People exchanged nervous looks, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even the woman in the navy blue suit seemed to have forgotten about her earlier complaint, now glancing toward the cockpit with concern. Then, the pilot who had defended Jamal earlier stepped into the first-class cabin. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the passengers as if looking for someone. And then, to Jamal's surprise, he walked directly toward him. Jamal's pulse quickened. "What now, Mr. Jamal?" the pilot said, his voice low but clear. "I need to speak with you for a moment." Jamal frowned, glancing around. People were watching again. He felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. He hesitated before finally unbuckling his seatbelt and standing up. The pilot gestured for him to follow, leading him toward the small area near the front of the cabin, just outside the cockpit door. When they were alone, the pilot turned to him. "Listen, I do not have much time to explain, but I need to ask you something important," he said. His voice had lost its earlier smoothness. It was more urgent now, more personal. "Does your father know about this flight?" Jamal blinked. "What? Of course he does. He booked the ticket." The pilot exhaled sharply, nodding. "Then you need to call him. Now." Jamal's confusion deepened. "Why? What is going on?" The pilot hesitated, as if weighing how much he should say. Finally, he leaned in slightly and lowered his voice even more. "There is more happening on this plane than what you think," he said. "Your father, he owns this airline, right?" Jamal stiffened. "How do you know that?" The pilot gave him a knowing look. "I have worked for your father's company for years. I recognize his name, and I know he would never let his son travel without making sure everything was secure." Jamal's heartbeat picked up. "Secure? What do you mean?" The pilot glanced around, making sure no one was listening. Then he leaned in even closer. "There is someone on this plane who should not be here," he said. "And I think they might be after you."